I won't lie to you, when TFT first dropped, I bought a few characters without farming, expecting to have fun with them while I grinded out the rest of the roster. Hot Stuff Blair was one, Poison Queen Freyna was another, but Muscle Daddied Esiemo grabbed my interest for one, being 900 credits to unlock, so we must be good, and two, pure skill based kits really grabbed my attention, as you need to learn a rotation to get the most out of them. After playing 20 minutes of Esiemo and learning his cooldowns and lackluster damage really holds him back, I picked up Freyna again and just didn't look back ever since. Then the new patch rolls around a few days ago, and, well, you can do this. So in this video, we'll be looking at my current go-to Esiemo builds to blast through the content, talking what modules matter the most, how his skill rotation works, what guns you should be rocking, which components you should be using as well, and ideally what reactor you should be grabbing. But before we get into all that, here's a word from today's sponsor. Many of you that have followed me over the years will probably be aware of how highly I rate Logitech for their stunning products. Ever since I bought my first G502 mouse 6 years ago, I've never looked back, and there truly will never be another mouse for me. So the amazing people at Logitech wanted me to talk to you about their Logiplay Days sale and how you could be missing out on a bargain as it's coming to an end this Sunday, 29th of September. They have a range of products discounted and for sale, ranging from keyboards to mice, and even this, the G733 Lightspeed wireless headset that I'm unboxing right now. Due to Logitech's amazing Lightspeed technology, not only will it be a reliable wireless headset, it also gives it an insane battery life, lasting between 20 to 29 hours of playtime, perfect for those long gaming sessions, or people like me that tend to forget to charge things often. But if sound quality is more your thing, the G733's unique hybrid mesh material works to reduce distortion and create precise, clean sounds. Combining with the latest DTS Headphone X 2.0 technology, it produces surround sound that is beyond that of typical 7.1. The G733 is a fantastic headset, so click the link below and check Logiplay Days sale out for yourself. Massive thank you for Logitech for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to the guide. Alright then, so let's head over to our modules section and we can start talking about builds. Now we do have 3 builds set up for you. I do have the 3 tabs right here. We have our general, which is going to be our main purpose. It's going to be our missions, it's going to be our mobbing, it's going to be everything you could possibly think of. This is just a typical set, typical standard to go for with Esiemo. Then we have something that's a little bit more catered towards Colossus fights if you do plan on taking it into that type of content. And then lastly we have a very fun, very meme-ish, very fast build, which is going to be Juggernaut, which is going to be building around our ultimate, but a different version of that, and I'll explain that a little bit more once we do get to it. So let's cover the general typical mobbing build first, and then we'll start heading our way across those tabs. Now, to fully understand how Esiemo kind of works, we want to be able to understand how to get the most out of our skill too. This is going to be the main way to increase the amount of damage that you will be dealing, and to do this, it has a relatively short cooldown, but we want to get this down as fast as possible, because the more times we can activate this, the more controlled we are with when it comes to our other skills, and also the more damage we'll be dealing out. So this is going to be a massive way to increase our DPS as Esiemo. Now, how this one works is that the more bombs or more mines that we currently have down, we're going to be increasing the amount of damage each one of those are going to be causing. As standard, this is going to be 35%, and it increases all the way up to 8 times. So you do have 5 stacks when it comes to your time bomb. You do have 3 stacks when it comes to your guided landmine. So by the time you've gone through both of those skills, you will be at 8 stacks. It can go higher. You can feel free to be. You're not limited to 8 mines out or 8 bombs out at a time. But the most bonus that you will receive is 8 times that 35%, and I believe from what I've seen from in the community, this bonus does go on top of anything else that you've done, so this is kind of like an additional multiplier that happens afterwards, so it kind of calculates everything that this bomb would have been doing, and then it times it by that 35% as well, to get you that extra bonus, which is absolutely fantastic, which means that crits are going to be really useful for Esiemo, but because of his ridiculously low crit rate, you need a lot of investment to really kind of grind into that, which is a bit of a shame. So the main way we're going to be kind of focusing with this build is low cooldowns and high impact. We kind of want to hit as hard as we can. We want to be able to get our skills back as fast as possible, because without our skills, we're essentially just a gun character, and that's not what we're intending to do with this build. So to do that, we are grabbing things like MP conversion and nimble fingers to get our cooldowns down as fast as possible. We have gone into focus on fire to increase our space skill power, because we are a fire descendant. We're going to have that 77.2% skill power put into every single one of the abilities, and this also gives us skill cooldown. We have added on focus on tech, but we haven't put any additional points in here. You can, if you've got the space, if you do want to be able to go a little bit further with this kind of build and you want to catalyze this as well as your sub module, feel free to be able to maximize this out. I mean, it's still going to be, when it comes to your skill 1, it's low enough modifiers that it's going to give you a decent chunk of additional damage, but we're mostly using it for that skill cooldown so that we can try and get up to 74.3% skill cooldown, which is quite important. It means that our abilities come back to around about 3.6 seconds on our 3 and 3.1 seconds on our 1, so we want to be able to get those back as fast as possible. And once again, it also really works nicely with our skill 2, so we can detonate it pretty much as often as we start chucking out those bombs. On top of that, we have gone for a crit package, but we haven't gone for a full crit package. What we've ideally gone here is going to go into skill hit damage. I do recommend damage over rate, just because the how it kind of works with the multipliers and everything like that. Because the base rate is so low, you're going to have very, very kind of like small returns if you do swap front lines for emergency measures. So I'd recommend, if you're going to go for one of them, I would recommend going into skill insight so that you get the biggest increase to your crit hit rate, and then just go heavily into damage. You could make an argument, you could take out skill concentration for the other one, which was going to be emergency measures. And then that will give you some extra crit rate on top of that. But I think it worked out to be an extra 2%-ish, 2-3%. It's very minimal, whereas the increase to damage is massive. So I would recommend going into damage more than going into crit rate. And I think skill insight is just enough that it just kind of makes it viable to kind of be slotted into the build. On top of that, we also have gone for a skill expansion to increase the range of our bombs. This means that we can actually use this quite effectively for mobbing. It's not necessary for this, and to be honest with you, when it comes to, it's a bit of a waste for your skill 3, but it is really good for your skill 4, and it is really good for your skill 1, especially if these do not land. If you actually just kind of like place them on the field and everything like that, you then can use these effectively to kind of deal all that damage. So you know, it's an alright mod, but there's just nothing really else that's kind of like worthwhile being able to slot in here. And I do think that the range kind of just gives it an extra versatility, especially with the ultimate, because that already has a reach out and touch kind of range, so you can expand that even further. We have also gone for increased HP because we do want some staying power. We do want to kind of stay upright when it comes to the fights, especially once our ultimate kind of reduces our defense by 30%, which is kind of annoying. At least then with increased HP we can stay alive, especially after we've activated our ability, and then we've gone into that kind of like stance mode, and it's just a bit of a weird animation, but it does leave us defenseless for a little bit of time. Last one I would recommend is going to be Dangerous Ambush. The reason why we're going for this, even though this is primarily going to be a Colossus type mod, it is really good for if the enemies aren't focusing on you, because the multipliers are already quite high. Being able to have an additional 24.9% increase to your skill power, and you can kind of just chuck your mines from distance as well. Meaning that you're not necessarily going to be targeted very often with this type of build if you are playing in a co-op environment. Being able to get that massive increase in damage is fantastic, and then because that skill power, then if you consider that every single mine that's got that on it is then getting multiplied by 35% once you activate your skill 2, it is an insane increase in terms of DPS. It is absolutely fantastic, and I don't think there's really a better mod that can kind of go here, so I do think Dangerous Ambush is 100% worth that slot. Now, in terms of Transcendence mods, the Esiemo doesn't have any really good mods. We have Creative Explosion, which would be good if it wasn't for the fact that it cuts your damage in half. We've got Cluster Bomb, but because of how Cluster Bomb works, it doesn't increase the amount of DPS that we would be casting anyway. It's alright, it's not terrible, but it's the fact that because it drops the 35% down to 15%, it just doesn't do enough for the build, so then the extra modifier that comes on top of it just isn't enough on top of that either. So it's a fun mod, it's just not necessarily a good mod to be able to go. And then Explosive Propaganda really nerfs your skill 3, and your skill 3 is one of the best ways to be able to actually deal damage with this, especially when stacking, because of how high that multiplier is. So none of the Transcendence mods are any good, really, to be honest with you. Explosive Evade is kind of decent. It's probably worth being able to, if you can get it high enough, if you've got the resources, getting it low down, then being able to swap it in here, because what this does is it basically works as an additional skill 3, but it also has a higher modifier on top of that, and it also then contributes to your skill 2, because this is an additional bomb that's going to be placed out there, so it kind of reduces the need, it kind of reduces the overall kind of like gameplay loop for Esiemo. It makes it a little bit easier just by being able to roll every 5 seconds. So I do think that Explosive Evade is just pretty much the general kind of like go-to in terms of increasing your DPS, and it also doesn't cost you any MP as well. So If you do have the space, Explosive Evade is quite nice. It's not necessary, but it definitely does help out the build when it comes to that. So this is my typical kind of like generic kind of build to go for. This pretty much has everything you kind of need it to do when it comes to missions. The idea is that you kind of like stack yourself up with skill 1, you then activate skill 3, you mix in a roll in there as well, and then once you've got all those stacked up on a stubborn enemy, you just activate skill 2, and they just pretty much kind of like just disappear into like a cloud. It's weird as to how good it is, pretty much is. So yeah, this is absolutely fantastic build, and I do think this is probably the one you should be gearing yourself up towards for the first time that you use Esiemo. Now if we swap that over to our Colossus build, you can have a look as to how this has kind of changed a little. This one requires a very specific type of setup to really get the most out and to be able to get that 2-second clip that you saw on Devourer at the start. Once again, we are using Explosive Evade. We aren't using as much cooldown. We have gone heavily into crits, so we have added in emergency measures this time because we want to get the most out of our crit hit rate and crit hit damage, because that is going to be where the majority of that damage is going to be coming from. We have gone for Fire Specialist instead of Focus on Fire. This is because that additional skill power is going to be quite nice here, so I would recommend that you do actually make that swap. We still use things like Dangerous Ambush. We have swapped HP over to Battle of Stamina because the skill duration is going to help us with our Madness proc, and that Madness proc is going to give us our additional skill power on top of everything as well. So the longer we can have that, the more mines that we can affect. And on top of that, Spear and Shield is just another great way of being able to increase base skill power. So yeah, this is pretty much like the package here. Now in terms of the rotation as to how this works, a couple of little bits of information for it. What you want to do is activate your skill 4 before the fight starts. The reason why is because we want Madness ready for us to start proccing all of our mines. So we can then put all that additional skill power into everything there. That 25% is going to go into every single mine that we place down. Just one thing to note on this is that bombs do snapshot when they're placed, meaning that if you have your buffs up once you do place them down in the field, they're then going to like keep that additional bonus. So that 25% is just going to keep hold of it. So you kind of want to have that duration a little bit longer than 14 seconds, and that means that you can go through your rotation of time bombs and then go through your rotation of guided landmines, and then that will essentially give you the most skill power that you could possibly put in. And once you've got up to 8, then you're able to use your skill 2, and then that will give you the most amount of damage increase per bomb. That pretty much wraps it up when it comes to the Colossus build. It's not as tanky, it's not as fast with the cooldowns. Essentially, you're trying to get that really fast kill, and then that's about it. You don't want to be spamming your skill 1, your skill 3 once you've got one stack on your cooldowns. You definitely want to be stacking these up as much as possible and then letting loose, so you have a very short kind of like damage window. But that's essentially how this one works, is you're trying to just deal as much damage as possible once the fight starts, and then you're just essentially relying on your guns to then fall back on while you then start generating and getting your cooldown back on every single one of your abilities. Now we'll make a quick swap over to we're going to talk about the Reactor, we're going to talk about components and weaponry, because the Juggernaut build behaves a little bit differently. So I want to talk about everything that kind of wraps up with the first two builds. Now in terms of like weaponry, the best one and most ideal is going to be Secret Garden. The reason why is because this gun was pretty much made for Esiemo if it wasn't for the fact that we have that dimension skill thing, which is going to give us custom recovery, but we're not necessarily using it for that. The reason why is because we are going for pest control. Every single one of your mines, so that's going to be your skill 1 as well as your skill 3, is going to be tech based, meaning that you have well, obviously the more stacks that you get into this gun, the better it is. I believe it caps out at 50%, but either way, you're able to get stacks of increasing skill power by just holding this gun out, and you're essentially just casting your abilities, and you're just trying to get your firearm attack as well as your skill power up as much as possible. And once again, remember that the abilities do snapshot, so if you are able to get to 3 stacks of pest control, you're then able to get the most amount of skill power into your abilities, which is why we recommend that you use skill 1 to be able to put down your time bombs first, because those can potentially proc pest control, and then once you do have your stacks, you then put down your guided landmines, and these ones will snapshot the increase to the skill power, ready for everything else that's going to be added on top of it. So you're essentially just kind of stacking up as much skill power as possible through your guns, through your passives, through your ultimate, and then ready to go with your skill 2, and that's why we're able to get that pretty much instant kill when it comes to Devourer. Now, in terms of other guns that I would recommend, there's not really too much. I would just recommend other generic type of guns that pretty much go. I mean, the Secret Garden's already a decent firearm, but you can go for things like Greg's Reverse Fate, you can go for your typical Enduring Legacies, you know, things like that that are reliable to fall back on. But in terms of, like, if you're using the skills efficiently, Secret Garden is pretty much the only gun I would recommend. Now, swapping over to the right side of the screen, we do have our reactor choices and our external components. Now, components-wise, it is just pretty much Slayer. Slayer is absolutely fantastic. This gives you the most amount of skill power. We have really high modifiers when it comes to Esiemo, so it makes the most sense to put in as much skill power as possible. Ideally, in terms of things that you're looking for, because this is going to be MP dependent in terms of the build, you are looking for MP recovery out of combat and max HP. You are looking for your max MP recovery in combat, and ideally, when it comes to your memory, you would want defense as well as MP recovery modifier. I think it is. It's one of the two. Essentially, you don't want resistance. You want something that's going to be helping out with your MP recovery, and then that will be the ideal slot-ins for this build. And that will give you the fastest way to get your MP back. That will mean that you don't have to worry too much when it comes to all of your skills, and it does also offset that of the skill cost increase, which is going to happen from Slayer as well as any unperfect versions of the Secret Garden. Because if we go back into this, you'll see that on the unique ability, basic information increases our skill cost. This does reduce down the more ranks that you put into this, so I'm expecting once it gets to level 4, this will be 0%, so that's just something else to consider when it comes to it. Lastly, the reactor side of things, we are going for a burning mechanics because we are primarily using fire and tech for our mines. You do want some decent rolls into this. There's a few different ways you can kind of roll into this. You can go for cooldown if you prefer it, if you want to get your mines back a little bit faster. But ideally, if you can get a skill critical hit damage increase because of how high his modifier is, you can get some pretty nutty damage. Unfortunately, his skill hit rate still kind of sucks, but because of how often you spam his abilities out, you can get some decent critical hits in there, and because critical hits get modified by your skill too, it is an insane amount of damage as to what you can kind of hit with that. So skill critical hit damage is not a bad shout. I would probably avoid going for skill critical hit rate, just because that does work off your base, so therefore a 30% increase to 5% is just kind of abysmal. It's like, what, not even 2%, I don't think, so what is the point in that? But skill critical hit damage, if you are going for Colossus fights, you definitely want your skill attack into Colossus. Being able to get some rolls into either tech or fire is fantastic. Skill cost is also a decent one because of how often you will be throwing out your abilities. There's several different ways that you can kind of roll when it comes to Esiemo, but I do think that being able to grab a ratio as well as a skill critical hit damage roll is just going to be your best overall type of reactor to be able to use. So now that those two builds are out of the way, let's take it on back to our third build. This is going to be the fun meme type of build. This is going to be your fast clears in terms of missions and everything like that. It is a very fun thing to just kind of mess about with, so I did want to kind of like bring it here. Now, you can still use most of the slots that we have done from the two previous builds, so you don't have to worry too much from there. I would recommend just unslotting this one, which is I believe was the triangle, which was Almandine, but to be able to fit in and maximize range. But we'll talk about that very, very shortly. The reason why we've gone for this one is because Creative Explosion does change your ultimate. So instead of it being a case of just being a pure DPS kind of like damage monster of having like over 7,000 damage modifier, it now reduces it down to just shy of 5,000, so like 4,900, and it also cuts down the cooldown on this as well. So instead of it being 80 seconds, this goes down to 40 seconds at base, and that means that when we do stack on our cooldowns of 74.3%, this does bring it down to around about 10 seconds. This does get lower, which is absolutely hilarious, because when you activate this ability, instead of getting an increase to your skill power and firepower and all that kind of thing, instead you then get Narcissism, which gives you a cooldown decrease. And this is going to be across the board, so this means you're going to get your mines back really quickly, but on top of that, it also affects this ability, meaning that this does come down to a 4-second cooldown, down from 40, which is fantastic. But it also means that this is going to be the main ability we'll be using. Now, the only downside to this is how much MP this is going to be kind of like using up, and to do that, to kind of like offset it, we have gone for MP Collector, because we're going to essentially use this to run into a group of enemies, and we're going to detonate, killing as many enemies as possible. And then there's going to be a good chance we're going to get some max MP back from that. So that is essentially how this one works. We are maximizing on skill cooldown, as you can see here. I'm probably showing a clip in the background, to be honest with you, so you can get an idea as to how this one works. But we are also working into as much range as possible, so we are grabbing maximized range as well as skill expansion. Weirdly, it says max expandable range is 200%, but interestingly enough, usually that means that we can only get to 16 meters, but it's still going up. So we're able to push this out to 23-meter radius, which is insane as to how much this kind of just like detonates an area around you. You kind of become a walking, talking nuke. We have gone for focus on fire, we have gone for focus on tech, but we have maximized this one out because we do have the abilities now. We have gone for some increased HP because once again we're essentially running into a group of enemies. And then, like I said, we have touched on MP Collector. Now the only other thing that I possibly would have swapped out here is if I had a little bit more kind of like space in terms of like capacity, which I am toying with the idea of catalyzing the mid-air maneuvering. I might swap out something like Fire Synctium and then just go for the crit rate, if I can actually spell it. There we go. So if I go for Skill Insight, I'll probably swap those two out there. And the reason why is because I would like to get this detonation to actually kind of crit, because then this does some insane kind of like nutty damage. And it just kind of bumps it up to over 10%, which makes it a little bit more reliable. But Fire Synctium is absolutely fine. It just boosts up your fire skill power. The only other one that I would probably recommend is if you want some defense as well, is to go in for Spear and Shield. That's still getting boosts up your skill power. Just feel free to mix and match as to how you want with that one. But if you feel like you need a little bit more defense, feel free to just take that out and just put in a base version of Spear and Shield, and you're pretty much good to go. Kit-wise, we're pretty much just rocking the exact same stuff. It doesn't really matter too much now. There is an argument that you could say Blue Beetle is worth slotting in here because this means that you get some arcane energy, and this gives you some skill critical hit rate, making it a little bit more reliable on your ultimate because that is a fusion ability. But because that's 30% of your base, once again, it's kind of an abysmal thing. It doesn't really matter too much. All I would say is that I would recommend just making sure you have a weapon that matches to your reactor, because skill power is more important here. If you are looking to be able to go for a different type of reactor here, if you can get into skill range, that is fantastic. If you can get into some ratios in terms of like damage, even better. And if you can get into something like some cooldown, so you can reduce it even further, so you can activate it a little bit more, and you're just running from group to group, then that is going to be probably best in slot. But anyway, with all that, it brings this video to an end. The buffs to Esiemo really brought him back into contention with some of the more fun skill-based builds to play right now. And while his kit still lacks compared to others, especially for Colossus fights, when built right, there really isn't many other descendants that can bring a smile to my face like he can. So this is the section I want to hear from you. How are you finding the first Descendants first season? What are your thoughts on Esiemo now that he's been buffed? And how hyped are you ready for Ultimate Freyner? Let me know all that and more down below. Massive thank you for making your way to the end of the video, and as I always say, keep yourself safe, keep yourselves well, and I'll see you all on the next video.